Welcome to the second part in a series of instructional videos designed to help players improve their ability at the game of Othello. This time round we're going to look at three things. Firstly, Othello's counterintuitive nature, board terminology, and minimisation. Don't worry if any of this baffles you at the moment, as all these things will become apparent as we move on. A counterintuitive game basically suggests that the most obvious strategy available to a player isn't the correct one. In the last video we set out the rules of Othello, and it's this rule set that makes Othello quite unique, because it's very simplistic. The aim of the game is to have as many pieces of your colour face up at the end of the game. So the simplest logic that someone can derive from this set of winning conditions is that if they take as many pieces as possible with each move, then they will come out at the end of it with the most pieces. This can create a fun but perhaps unstructured game to watch if both players adopt this strategy. Now it may well be that this concept is derived from players' experience in other games, such as chess or drafts, where the person who has captured the most pieces clearly has a winning advantage. This simply doesn't work in Othello, because for the most part, if one player takes lots of pieces on their move, those pieces can simply be taken back quite easily by their opponent on their move. Showing at the moment, you can see what basically is bad play on the internet, as players strive to take as many pieces as possible to win the game. But if simply taking as many pieces as possible isn't the correct strategy, then what is? To answer that, we have to look at the limitations created by the board itself. But before we do, let's step aside for a moment and set out some of the important terminology that experienced players use when referring to the board. The first concept to consider is very simple. We saw last time that we can use grid references to refer to a specific square on the board. However, Othello is made up of a vast number of generalisations, and players will often refer to the board using the points of the compass as one of those generalisations. So for example, in this position, we might refer to white having moves only in the east, and black only having moves in the west. If we move play on a few turns, this position changes slightly. We can now see that black has moves in the northwest, and white only has moves in the southeast. So during gameplay, a player may say something like, "All my moves in the south are bad." Secondly, certain areas have technical names that are important to Othello strategy. The first example is the Sweet 16. This is the 16 squares that make up the centre of the board. Now it was once believed when Othello was originally developed that the Sweet 16 was key to a winning strategy, and that the first player to move outside of this region would be putting themselves at a disadvantage, because reaching the edges was deemed to be all important. Now this has long been dismissed, however the Sweet 16 still gets mentioned from time to time, as it can form a generalisation when finding a good move during the opening stages of the game. For the time being, just be aware that the Sweet 16 may get mentioned occasionally in discussion. The next set of terms relates to the edges. Again, we will come to the importance of some of these later, but for now just take away the following. The centre two squares on each edge are known as the B squares. Either side of those are known as the A squares, and slightly more important are the C squares, which are any square on the edge of the board and next to a corner. Finally, and most importantly, the last set are known as the X squares. These are the four squares that lie one diagonally in from each corner, so that is B2, G2, G7 and B7. All these squares, but particularly the X squares, form an important part of Othello's strategy, which we can now focus on. Minimisation as a strategy is basically taking as few pieces as possible with each move. To understand why this is the correct strategy, we have to look at how we go about stabilising discs. Now we've already hinted that pieces can easily change from one colour to another from turn to turn, So what we need is a means to prevent this from happening, and so lock pieces in so they can't be changed back to our opponent's colour. The way in which you go about this is by taking a corner. Corners are unique because they're the only square on the board that can't be taken away from a player once they've obtained it. In fact, to actually flip a corner, you'd have to make a move off the board, which is of course impossible. So once a player has a corner, they can go about expanding outwards, because having a piece of the same colour next to the corner will then in turn lock those pieces in. This is what we mean by stabilising discs. So if we want to take a corner for ourselves, it would stand to reason that we want to avoid giving them away as well. There are certain positions on edges that are best to avoid, which mostly involves C-squares. So here's an example. White decides to play the C-square B1. What this allows black to do is attack the corner by playing C1. Now it's white's go. White can ignore the threat and allow black to take the corner on its next move, or alternatively it can take D1. But this is fruitless, because of black's piece at E1, allowing black to get to the corner anyway. There are many other possibilities for creating potential opportunities for a player to grab the corner involving edges. The point to take away is that you want to be the one that's gaining a corner as a result. The other way in which a corner can be obtained is by the X-squares. In fact, as long as a player has a piece on the main diagonal, there are no real tricks necessary to take the corner once an X-square has been played. An X-square typically gives instant access. Now once you realise this, the aim of the game changes. No longer is it about taking pieces, it's about getting to the corner and not playing the X-squares. If both players have this aim, then what you'll typically find is the areas around the corners, and specifically the X-squares, are the last few squares to be played, as both players try to avoid them. Your aim now is not to be the player that plays an X-square first. Now how you go about this is by keeping as many options available to you as possible. If you take lots of pieces, all you're doing is taking away lots of potential moves, and if you run out of moves that aren't an X-square, then you'll be forced to play an X-square. As in this example here, we can see that white has been run out of moves early on, so black can dictate where white plays. If black plays A6, then it gives white just one option available to it. Black then takes A2, giving white only one option again, but this time it's the B2 X-square. White is forced to play this, and all black has to do is cut through the main diagonal to reach the corner. We can see another example of why the corners are so important. In this slightly exaggerated example, black has a single piece at D4. White has every other piece on the board occupied, apart from the corners. So black has the remaining 4 moves available to him. If we play these out, we see that black actually wins by 40 to 24. So until the end of the game, and especially early on, it can be argued that the person with the most available moves is winning, and not the person with the most pieces on the board. So that sets out the first step in our understanding towards a good Othello strategy. The only problem is you're not always going to come across players who want to simply maximise against you as you minimise. Both players will want to try to minimise. This is where Othello suddenly gets much more complicated, because both players are trying to keep their options open. In the next video, the aim is to start to consider how it's possible to go about this.